The air at the Miller Estate auction tasted of diesel fumes, dust, and the bittersweet tang of a family farm giving up the ghost. It was 1972, and the auctioneer's rhythmic chant was the soundtrack of a changing world. I stood beside my father, Henry, his hands, thick and calloused as old leather, resting on the fender of a faded red Farmel M. He wasn't bidding. He never bid. He just came to watch, to bear witness. "Look at that, Thomas," he grumbled, his voice a low rumble like stones in a creek bed. He nodded toward the center of the action, where Franklin Hayes was holding his bidder number high. Franklin was our neighbor to the west, a man whose ambition was as wide as his new denim overalls. The prize was a brand new, gleaming John Deere 4020, its green paint so bright it hurt the eyes under the high September sun. "That tractor ain't been paid for by the man who owned it, and it won't be paid for by the man who's buying it," Dad said. "It's the bank's tractor, always will be." The auctioneer's gavel fell with a sharp crack. "Sold, to bidder number 73, Mr. Franklin Hayes. Congratulations on a fine piece of John Deere iron." Franklin beamed, slapping his friend on the back. He caught my father's eye and sauntered over, his boots crunching on the dry gravel. He was a decade younger than Dad, with a soft belly that spoke of good times and easy credit. "Morning, Henry. Thomas," he said, tipping his new seed corn cap. "Figured it was time to upgrade. Can't make money with museum pieces." He glanced pointedly at the old Farmel M we'd driven over, its engine ticking quietly as it cooled. Our M wasn't a show tractor, but it was honest. Every scratch on its hood told a story. Every grease stain was a testament to a job done. Its two-cylinder gasoline engine was simple, reliable. I could tear it down and put it back together with my eyes closed. My father just chewed on his unlit pipe stem. "A man who owns his tools, Franklin, sleeps better at night than a man who just rents 'em from the bank." Franklin chuckled, a condescending sound. "Times are changing, Henry. You got to spend money to make money. Land prices are up. Corn's over $2 a bushel. You can't scratch out a living on 200 acres with a tractor from the 40s anymore. I'm farming 1,000 acres this year." 1,000? Couldn't do that with your old Poppin' John. He was referring to our other main tractor, a 1951 John Deere Model A, another machine Dad had bought with cash years ago. It was loud and slow, but it would pull a two-bottom plow through clay soil from sunup to sundown without a single complaint. My younger brothers, Richard and Samuel, drifted over, drawn by the new tractor's allure. Richard, always the ambitious one, looked at the 4020 with undisguised envy. Samuel, who followed Richard's lead in all things, just nodded along, his eyes wide. "That's a beautiful machine, Mr. Hayes," Richard said, wiping a hand on his jeans before shaking Franklin's. "She's a diesel, son," Franklin boasted. "Synchro-range transmission, power steering, enclosed cab with a radio. This ain't your daddy's kind of farming." He winked. "You boys ought to talk some sense into the old man. There's a fortune to be made out here. But you gotta have the right equipment." He walked away, leaving a gulf between us. My brothers looked at Dad, then at the old Farmel, and I could see the seeds of discontent taking root. They saw Franklin's new iron, his expanding acreage, his new pickup truck. They saw the future. My father, however, saw a mountain of paper, a chain of debt that wrapped around a man's neck and squeezed tighter with every bad harvest, every price drop, every tick of the interest clock. That evening, the tension was thick around the dinner table. My mother, Martha, served pot roast and potatoes, her movements quiet and deliberate, trying to smooth over the cracks that were starting to show in our family. "Franklin Hayes is a fool," Dad declared, stabbing a potato with his fork. He's leveraged to the hilt. One bad year, and the bank will own him lock, stock, and barrel. But Dad, Richard started, his voice edged with frustration. He's farming 5 times what we are. His corn looked twice as good as ours this year. We spent half the spring fixing the planter instead of planting. That old Alice Chalmers combine broke down 3 times during soybean harvest. We're falling behind. We're not behind, Dad countered, his voice rising. We're free. We own this land. We own our machines. When we sell our grain, the money is ours. It doesn't go to a banker in a suit in town. It goes into our pockets. Don't you understand what that means? It means we're poor, Samuel blurted out, then shrank back as Dad's gaze fell on him. We are not poor, Dad said, his voice low and dangerous. We have everything we need. A roof over our heads, food on this table, and land that's been in this family for 3 generations. No piece of paper in a filing cabinet downtown can take that away from us. That is not poverty. That is wealth. He pushed his chair back and stood up, his tall frame casting a long shadow in the lamplight. I'm going to the barn. And I'll tell you boys this one more time. Never finance tractors and equipment. Never go into debt for something that depreciates. You borrow for land, maybe, because God ain't making any more of it. But you never, ever borrow for iron. Iron rusts. Iron breaks. And the banknote is always due, rain or shine. He walked out, the screen door slamming shut behind him. Richard looked at me, his eyes pleading. Thomas, you're the oldest. Talk to him. We can't keep on like this. We're becoming a joke in the county. I didn't have an answer for him. I saw the logic in his words. The work was hard, the hours long. A newer tractor with a cab would have been a godsend during the dusty days of summer cultivation or the frigid mornings of winter chores. But I also heard the conviction in my father's voice, the deep, bone-bred wisdom of a man who'd lived through the Great Depression and seen neighbors lose everything they'd ever worked for. Before we go any further with this story, I have to stop and ask you something. My father's advice was the rock our family was built on, for better or worse. I'm willing to bet a lot of you out there heard similar words from your own fathers or grandfathers. What was the one piece of financial advice, the one rule about money or debt that was passed down in your family? Drop a comment below and tell me about it. It's important to remember these things, to honor the wisdom of those who came before us. The winter of 1973 was a hard one. A deep, wet snow in November was followed by a bitter cold that locked the countryside in a sheath of ice. It was that February that Dad's cough got worse. He'd always had a rasp from years of breathing in field dust and chaff. But this was different. It was a deep, rattling sound that seemed to shake his whole body. He refused to see a doctor, claiming it was just a winter cold. But by March, he could barely make it from the house to the barn without stopping to catch his breath. He passed away in his own bed on a Tuesday morning in early April, just as the frost was starting to leave the ground. The doctor, who finally came out to the farm at my mother's tearful insistence, called it pneumonia, but we all knew it was more than that. It was a lifetime of hard labor. His body was just worn out, like a faithful old tractor whose engine had finally seized. His death left a hole in our world that felt as big and empty as the sky over the prairie. But grief doesn't stop the seasons from turning. The ground was thawing, and the fields needed to be plowed. Dad's will was simple. The farm, the equipment, and the house were left equally to my mother and his 3 sons. In practice, it meant the decisions now fell to me, Richard, and Samuel. The first major argument came less than a week after the funeral. We were in the machine shed, the air thick with the smell of old oil and damp earth. I was going over the John Deere, checking the fluids and greasing the fittings, getting it ready for ploughing. Richard stood with his arms crossed, leaning against the doorway. "This is a waste of time, Thomas." "It's called maintenance, Richard," I said, without looking up. "Something Dad taught us to do every spring." "I'm not talking about the grease gun," he snapped. "I'm talking about this." He waved a hand at the shed full of old, paid-for machinery. "Dad's gone. We have to think about the future now. We can't do it with this junk." "This junk is what put food on our table our whole lives," I shot back, my knuckles white on the grease gun handle. "And Dad worked himself into an early grave doing it." Richard's voice echoed in the cavernous shed. "I'm not going to do that. Sam and I went to the bank yesterday. We talked to Mr. Henderson." I stopped what I was doing and stood up slowly. "You did what?" Samuel, who had been lingering behind his brother, stepped forward. "Just to see, Tom. Just to see what our options were. Mr. Henderson said the farm is in great shape, financially. No debt. He said we'd be fools not to leverage it. He's willing to give us a loan for $100,000. Enough for a new John Deere 4430, a 6-bottom plough, a new planter, and a down payment on a gleaner combine." I felt a cold dread creep up my spine. It was Franklin Hayes's voice coming out of my brother's mouth. "And Dad's body is barely cold in the ground. You went behind my back and talked to the banker about putting the farm in hawk? The very thing he warned us against his entire life?" "It's not putting it in hawk. It's an investment," Richard insisted. "The interest rates are low, maybe 7%. With the price of corn, we'll pay it off in 5 years, easy. We could pick up another 80 acres to rent. We could finally make some real money. Or we could lose everything," I said, my voice quiet. "You don't know what the price of corn will be next year. You don't know if it will rain. You don't know if interest rates will stay at 7%. The only thing you know for sure is that the bank will want its payment on the 1st of every month." We argued for an hour, our voices rising and falling in the quiet machine shed. It was 2 against 1. My mother, lost in her own grief, didn't want to be in the middle of it. In the end, they wore me down. I was outvoted. I didn't have the heart to split the farm, to break up the one thing my father had spent his life building. Reluctantly, I agreed, on one condition. "We keep the old equipment," I said, my jaw tight. "All of it. The farm awl, the John Deere, the old combine. We keep it in working order, just in case." Richard rolled his eyes. "Fine. You can play with your antiques all you want, Thomas. While Sam and I are out in the field in an air-conditioned cab listening to the radio, you can sweat on that old M. But when the checks come in, we all cash 'em." 2 weeks later, a flatbed truck rumbled down our long gravel driveway. It carried the biggest, greenest tractor I had ever seen up close. The John Deere 4430 was a monster, its tires taller than I was. The salesman, a slick talker in a polo shirt, gave Richard the keys and a quick rundown of the controls. It had a turbocharged diesel engine that hummed with a power I'd never known. The cab was a space-age bubble of glass and steel, sealed against the dust and noise. Richard climbed in, a huge grin on his face. He turned the key, and the engine roared to life with a deep, throaty growl, so different from the simple pop-pop-pop of our old 2-cylinders. He put it in gear and drove it off the truck, leaving deep ruts in the soft earth of the farmyard. Franklin Hayes drove over in his pickup, a thermos of coffee in his hand, and the two of them stood there, admiring the machine like it was a golden idol. I turned and walked back to the machine shed. The smell of gasoline and old grease was a comfort. I laid a hand on the warm hood of the Farmer Lem. It felt like a betrayal. I spent the rest of that day tuning the old tractor, not because it needed it, but because I needed to feel connected to something real, something I understood. I pulled the plugs, cleaned them, and set the gap. I took the carburetor apart on the workbench, carefully cleaning the jets with a piece of wire and blowing out the passages. I checked the timing on the magneto, that simple, reliable spark of life. I felt the familiar weight of the wrenches in my hands, the satisfying seating of a bolt as it tightened. This was my world, a world of mechanics I could control, not a world of finance and variable interest rates that controlled me. While Richard and Samuel were learning the new systems, I was patching a pinhole leak in the radiator of the John Deere A, using a little bit of solder and a lot of patience. They laughed at me from the yard, but when I finished, the old tractor held its water just fine. They saw a rusty relic. I saw a survivor. The community's reaction was predictable. At the co-op, at church, at the feed store, everyone congratulated Richard and Samuel on their forward thinking. They were the talk of the township. The Henderson boys were finally getting serious about farming. I was seen as the stubborn, backward-looking brother, a relic like the machines I insisted on keeping. Old man Henderson, the banker, would clap Richard on the back when he saw him in town. He'd just give me a polite, pitying nod. They were the future. I was the past. And for a while it seemed like they were right. The mid-1970s were a boom time for American agriculture. The deal to sell massive amounts of grain to the Soviet Union had sent commodity prices soaring. Secretary of Agriculture Earl Butz was on the radio telling farmers to get big or get out and to plant fence-a-row to fence-a-row. The mood in the heartland was electric with optimism. It felt like the good times would never end. For our farm, the new equipment seemed like a miracle. Richard, sitting high in the cab of the 4430, could plough more in one day than Dad and I could have ploughed in 3 with the old John Deere A and the Farmer Lem working together. The new 6-bottom plough turned the black soil over in neat, perfect ribbons. Planting was a breeze with the new 12-row planter. For the first time in our lives, we were done with fieldwork by early June, instead of struggling to finish by the 4th of July. Richard and Samuel were ecstatic. They spent their evenings studying machinery brochures and land sale listings. Franklin Hayes became their mentor, advising them on fertilizer application rates, new hybrid seeds, and, most importantly, how to talk to the banker. Credit is a tool, just like a wrench or a plow, Franklin would say, leaning against the hood of his new pickup. You boys are smart. You're using it to build an empire. That first year we had a bumper crop. The weather cooperated perfectly, and the new technology allowed us to manage our acres with an efficiency we'd never dreamed of. When we sold the corn that fall, the check was for a staggering amount, more money than our father had seen in 5 years combined. At the kitchen table, Richard laid out the figures. After the payment to the bank, which was substantial, and our input costs, there was still a handsome profit. "See, Thomas," he said, his face flushed with victory. "I told you, this is how you do it. This is modern farming." I had to admit, the numbers were impressive, but something still gnawed at me. I pointed to the line item for the loan payment. "That's a big number, Richard, and it's going to be there every year for the next 10 years. What happens if the price of corn drops back to $1.50? "It won't," Samuel chimed in. "The whole world wants our grain. The Russians are buying everything we can grow. Prices are only going up." They voted to use the profits not to pay down the principal on the loan, but as a down payment on another 160 acres of land that came up for sale down the road. They bought it on a land contract, with a balloon payment due in 5 years. They were doubling down. Franklin Hayes did the same, buying up another quarter section. The whole county was caught in a frenzy of expansion, a fever dream of ever-increasing land values and commodity prices. I was the ghost at the feast, the constant reminder of a more cautious time. I continued to maintain the old equipment, much to their amusement. While they were out dissing the new ground with the 4430, I was in the shed, overhauling the transmission on the Farm All M. I spent a week with the gears laid out on a clean canvas, carefully inspecting each tooth, replacing the worn-out bearings. They saw it as my strange hobby. I saw it as an insurance policy. I took my third of the profits, a modest sum compared to what they were reinvesting, and I put it in a savings account at a different bank in the next town over. I paid cash for my parts, bought my own fuel for the old tractors, and kept my own set of books. Richard called it my scaredy cat fund. They were seen as the ambitious, successful brothers, and I was the eccentric one who couldn't let go of the past. At family gatherings, my aunts and uncles would praise Richard and Samuel for their business sense and ask me gently if I was ever going to get with the times. The isolation was a heavy weight. There were days I looked at their easy success, at the speed with which they accomplished their work, and I wondered if Dad had been wrong. Maybe the world had changed completely. Maybe debt was the new way, and caution was just another word for failure. The fall of 1978 was another good one. The crops were strong, and the prices held. Richard and Samuel bought a second new tractor, an International Harvester 1086, to keep up with their expanded acreage. The farm was now 1,000 acres of owned and rented ground, a sprawling operation held together by a web of loans and land contracts. Our debt was astronomical, but as Richard liked to say, so was our net worth, at least on paper. One cool evening in November, I was at the co-op getting a hydraulic hose repaired for the old John Deere. A group of older farmers, men from my father's generation, were huddled around the wood stove, drinking bitter coffee from styrofoam cups. Their conversation was more subdued than the triumphant talk of the younger crowd. "Heard the prime rate went up another 0.5 point," one of them, a wiry old farmer named Earl, muttered into his cup. "That's the 3rd time this year." "The boys at the bank are getting nervous about all this inflation," another added. "Talk of tightening things up." Then Earl looked over at me. "Your brothers are still buying land, aren't they, Thomas?" I just nodded. "Your father was a smart man," Earl said, shaking his head slowly. "He always said, 'Don't bet the farm at the casino,' and right now, the whole damn country feels like a casino." I drove home as the sun set, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. The beauty of it was unsettling. In the mailbox at the end of our lane was a thick envelope from the bank. I took it inside and left it on the kitchen table where Richard would see it. Later that night, I heard him talking with Samuel in low, worried tones. I walked into the kitchen, and Richard was holding a letter, his face pale. "What is it?" I asked. He looked up, his usual confidence gone, replaced by a flicker of fear. "It's from the bank. They're notifying us about the loan on the 4430. Because of the prime rate, our variable interest rate is being adjusted." He slid the paper across the table. I picked it up and read the new number. 12%. It had nearly doubled from our original rate, and in the fine print, a single sentence stood out, cold and sharp as a shard of ice. "This rate is subject to further adjustments based on market conditions." Outside, the wind began to pick up, rattling the old windows of the farmhouse. A storm was rolling in from the west. I looked at my brothers' faces, illuminated by the single bare bulb above the kitchen table, and I saw that they were finally starting to understand. The banknote is always due, rain or shine. And it was starting to look a lot like rain. That letter from the bank was the first tremor. The spring of 1979 brought the first real crack in the earth beneath our feet. The sky turned a hard, unforgiving blue and stayed that way. The April showers never came. May was dry and windy, the soil we'd so carefully tilled turning to a fine powder that blew away on the relentless southern breeze. By June, the young corn stalks, which should have been knee-high and a deep, waxy green, were stunted and pale, their leaves curling inward during the heat of the day, as if in prayer for a rain that never fell. Richard drove the big 4430 across the fields, pulling the cultivator, the diesel engine's turbo whining against the strain. But cultivating dry ground only seemed to help the sun bake the moisture out faster. He'd come in at night, his face etched with worry, covered in a fine layer of dust that had worked its way past the seals of his air-conditioned cab. The new technology could turn the soil, but it couldn't make it rain. One sweltering afternoon in July, the 4430 sputtered to a stop in the middle of the far 80. Richard climbed down, baffled. The fuel tank was full. The engine wasn't overheating. He couldn't see anything obviously wrong. He tried to start it again, but the engine would only turn over, a dead, lifeless sound. He walked the mile back to the house in the blistering sun, his frustration simmering. "It's just dead," he said, throwing his cap on the kitchen table. "No warning, no smoke, nothing." We all drove out in the pickup. I climbed into the cab. The dash was a constellation of gauges and lights I barely understood. I turned the key. Nothing but the sound of the starter motor. It wasn't a simple fuel or spark issue like on the old tractors. "Sounds like the fuel shut off solenoid," I guessed. Or something in the injection pump. Richard just stared at the massive diesel engine. "I don't even know where to start looking." He didn't have the tools or the knowledge. The engine was a complex beast of high-pressure fuel lines, intricate timing, and systems we'd never worked on. The next morning, a mechanic had to come out from the John Deere dealership, 60 miles away. He arrived in a shiny service truck, charging us by the hour from the moment he left the shop. He diagnosed the problem in 20 minutes. A failed electronic module in the transmission control that had, for safety reasons, also cut power to the fuel pump. A tiny box of wires and transistors, no bigger than a deck of cards. The part itself was $200. The bill for the service call, labor and mileage was over $500. The tractor was down for 2 days while we waited for the part to be shipped in. $500 for a little black box. I could have bought a whole running engine for the Farmall M for that kind of money. As the mechanic worked, I saw Franklin Hayes drive by on the road, slowing his pickup to see what was going on. He didn't stop. I'd seen him in town a week earlier, arguing with the manager at the grain elevator. His face was flushed, his voice tight with anger. The word was that he was having trouble getting enough operating credit to buy fertilizer for the next season. The empire was showing its first cracks. The easy money was drying up. The drought broke in August with a series of violent thunderstorms that flattened what little crop we had. The harvest that fall was a disaster. Our yields were less than half of what we'd budgeted for. The price of corn had softened too. President Carter had announced a grain embargo against the Soviet Union in response to their invasion of Afghanistan. Suddenly, our biggest customer was gone, and the market was flooded with grain that had nowhere to go. The numbers at the kitchen table that winter were grim. The income from the crop barely covered our input costs. It didn't even touch the principal on our loans. The massive payment to the bank had to be made by taking out another, smaller loan, an operating loan for the next year, but at a staggering 18% interest. We were borrowing money to pay back borrowed money, It was a vicious, spinning circle, and it was pulling us down. Richard was quiet, withdrawn. The easy confidence he'd worn like a new coat was gone, replaced by a permanent frown. He'd spend hours staring out the window at the bleak, snow-covered fields, the weight of his decisions pressing down on him. Samuel just looked lost, his eyes darting between me and Richard, waiting for someone to tell him it would all be okay. I didn't say, "I told you so." There was no satisfaction in it. We were all in the same sinking boat. I just kept my head down. I went out to the machine shed, my sanctuary. I drained the oil from the old tractors, refilled them, and ran their engines for a while to keep the batteries charged and the parts lubricated. The simple, rhythmic pop, pop, pop of the John Deere ore was a comforting sound in a world that had grown terrifyingly complicated. The year 1981 was the year the floor fell out. The Federal Reserve, in a desperate attempt to curb runaway inflation, pushed the prime interest rate to over 20%. Our variable rate loans, the ones the banker had assured us were a modern, flexible tool, became a guillotine. The notices came in the mail, one after another, each one a hammer blow. Our interest rate was now 21%. Our payments ballooned to an impossible size. It was happening all over the county. Auction notices started appearing in the paper like obituaries. Good, hard-working families, who had been millionaires on paper just a few years before, were being wiped out. The bright green and red paint of newly purchased combines and tractors faded under the auctioneer's gaze, sold for pennies on the dollar to pay off the bankers who had encouraged the borrowing spree in the first place. The breaking point for Franklin Hayes came that spring. His operating loan was denied. He had no cash to buy seed, no fuel to run his fleet of massive, thirsty tractors. The bank called his notes. The auction was set for the first Saturday in June. I went, just as my father had gone to the Miller auction years before. Not to bid, but to bear witness. The mood was the opposite of that day in 1972. There was no optimism, only a heavy, sorrowful silence. The crowd was thin, mostly neighbors with haunted eyes, watching a reflection of their own fears. The John Deere 4020 that Franklin had bought with such pride was there, its paint now faded and scratched, a piece of collateral waiting to be claimed. Franklin stood by his house, his shoulders slumped, his new denim overalls replaced by old, worn ones. He looked 10 years older. He didn't make eye contact with anyone. His wife was serving coffee and cookies on the porch, her face a brave, brittle mask that couldn't hide the devastation in her eyes. It was a funeral for a lifetime of work. I watched as the auctioneer sold off his tools, his livestock, his machinery. The prices were heartbreakingly low. No one had any money to spend. The big tractors, the ones that had symbolized his success, were bought back by the dealership for a fraction of what he owed on them. In the end, the land itself was sold on the courthouse steps. Franklin Hayes, the man who was going to build an empire, was left with nothing but the clothes on his back and a mountain of deficiency judgments. He had lost everything. Our own foreclosure notice arrived a month later. It came in a certified letter, the green slip a harbinger of doom. We had missed 2 payments. The bank was initiating proceedings against the entire farm. The new land, the rented ground, and the original 200 acres that had been in our family for 100 years. They were going to take it all. That night was the darkest of my life. Richard sat at the kitchen table, the letter spread out before him, his head in his hands. He was sobbing, not loud, but with quiet, racking gasps of a man utterly broken. Samuel sat across from him, pale and silent, looking like a little boy again. My mother was in her room, the door closed, her quiet grief a palpable presence in the old house. After a long time, Richard finally looked up at me. His eyes were red-rimmed and full of a despair I had never seen before. The last of his pride had been burned away, leaving only the raw ash of failure. "You were right, Thomas," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "Dad was right. I was a fool. I was so arrogant. I thought I knew better." He choked on a sob. "I've lost it. I've lost Dad's farm. It's all my fault." I pulled up a chair and sat down beside him, putting a hand on his shoulder. It felt thin and bony, all the strength gone out of it. "No," I said, my own voice thick with emotion. "You didn't do this alone. We all let it happen. And it's not over yet." He looked at me, confused. "What do you mean?" "The letter. They're taking everything." "They're taking everything that has a lien against it," I said, pulling my chair closer. "But they can't take what's already paid for." I stood up and went to my room, returning with a small, battered metal lockbox. I set it on the table and opened it. Inside were several passbook savings books and a folder of receipts. "What's this?" Samuel asked, his voice barely a whisper. "It's my scaredy cat fund," I said, looking at Richard. "It's my share of the profits from the good years, the money I didn't pour back into new iron or more land. It's not much in the grand scheme of things, but it's a start." I pushed one of the passbooks across the table. "And this," I said, tapping the folder, "is a receipt for every part, every drop of oil, every gallon of gas I've put into Dad's old tractors. They're tuned up, gassed up, and ready to go. They belong to us, not the bank." A tiny flicker of hope sparked in Richard's eyes. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying we go see Mr. Henderson tomorrow morning. We're going to give him back the keys to the 1086 and the 4430. We're going to let him have the new land we bought. We're going to cut our losses. But we are going to fight for this house and the original 200 acres. We're going to show him we have a way to farm it, a way to make it profitable without any new debt. We're going to save our home." The next morning, the three of us walked into the bank. We looked like a defeated army, but for the first time in years, we were a united one. Richard, humbled and quiet, let me do the talking. I laid it all out for Mr. Henderson, the banker. I showed him my savings, a modest but solid cushion of cash. I explained my plan, to go back to basics, to farm the home place, the 200 acres we could manage with the old, reliable, paid-for equipment. Our input costs would be minimal. Our only major expense would be fuel and seed, which my savings could cover for the first year. We would be small, but we would be solvent. Henderson listened, his face impassive. He looked at the foreclosure notice on his desk, then at the three of us. He saw the desperation, but he also saw the determination. Maybe he saw a flicker of my father in me. He knew our family had been banking there for 3 generations. He knew we were good people who had gotten caught in the same trap as everyone else. He steepled his fingers and looked at me for a long, silent minute. "Your father was a stubborn man, Thomas," he said finally. "But he was an honest one. He never missed a payment in his life." He sighed, a deep, weary sound. "All right, we'll release the lien on the original deed. The new land and the new equipment will satisfy the bulk of the debt. There will be a remainder, but we can restructure it into a small, manageable loan against future crops from the home farm. Don't make me regret this." We walked out of that bank, feeling like we'd been pulled from a burning building. We had lost so much. The dream of a farming empire was a pile of ashes at our feet. We had lost 1,000 acres and hundreds of thousands of dollars in machinery, but we had saved the one thing that mattered. We had saved our home. That summer felt like stepping back in time. We sold the big new plough and planter for a pittance to a salvage yard. I pulled the old John Deere two-bottom plough out of the back of the shed, cleaned the rust off the mould boards, and hooked it up to the John Deere A. Richard climbed onto the seat, a place he hadn't sat in nearly a decade. He looked awkward at first, wrestling with the hand clutch and the unfamiliar controls. But as he started down the field, the old tractor barking its familiar rhythm, I saw his shoulders relax. He was turning over just 2 furrows at a time, a snail's pace compared to the 6 he was used to. But every foot of that ground was ours. The diesel fumes were replaced by the smell of gasoline and hot oil. The silence of the cab was replaced by the roar of the engine and the cry of the gulls following the plough. It was the sound of honest work. It was the sound of survival. We farmed that year with the old machines. The Farmall M pulled the 4-row planter. I spent my evenings in the shed, keeping them running, patching tires, tinkering with carburetors, using skills my father had taught me, skills I had honed while my brothers were chasing a dream. They worked beside me, learning, their hands growing calloused again, their faces burned by the sun and wind. The division that had grown between us was gone, replaced by a shared purpose. We were a family again, bound together not by profit and loss statements, but by the soil under our fingernails. The community, what was left of it, watched us. The old-timers, like Earl from the co-op, would stop by. They wouldn't say much, just nod at the sight of the old Farmall cultivating the corn, a quiet acknowledgement of a truth they had never forgotten. Some of the younger farmers who had managed to hold on would ask for my help fixing their own older equipment, the backup machinery they were now forced to rely on. I became known not as the backward brother, but as the one who knew how to make things last. One day, I saw Franklin Hayes working on a road crew, patching potholes in the summer heat. I pulled over. He looked thin, tired, but the shame in his eyes was gone, replaced by a kind of weary resignation. We talked for a few minutes about the weather, about the price of beans. As I was about to leave, I asked him if he still had his old Lincoln arc welder. He said it was one of the few things he'd managed to keep. I told him the frame on my old disc had a crack in it, and asked if I could hire him to come fix it on Saturday. I offered him $50, which was more than fair. He looked at me, his eyes glistening, and just nodded. He came that Saturday and did a beautiful job, laying a perfect bead along the cracked steel. When I paid him, he shook my hand, and in that handshake, a quiet understanding passed between us. We were both survivors, just in different ways. Years passed. The 1980s gave way to the 90s. Our farm never got big again. We stayed at 200 acres. We paid off the restructured loan from the bank. We bought a slightly newer tractor, a 1970s model International Harvester, but we paid cash for it at an auction. Richard and Samuel found their peace with a smaller, more deliberate way of farming. Richard developed a knack for raising hogs, finding a profitable niche that didn't require huge acreage. Samuel became an expert at seed saving, and our input costs dropped even further. We weren't getting rich, but we were comfortable. We were free. My own son, Henry, named after his grandfather, grew up in the seat of the Farmall M, his small hands on the big steering wheel as he sat on my lap. When he was old enough, I didn't show him machinery brochures. I showed him how to set the points on a magneto. I taught him how to listen to an engine and diagnose a problem by its sound. I showed him the difference between a bolt that was tight and a bolt that was stripped. One warm autumn afternoon, when Henry was about 16, we were in the machine shed, working on the old John Deere A. We had the head off, and I was showing him how to lap the valves, using a grinding compound and a simple suction cup tool. He looked up at me, his brow furrowed in concentration. "Dad," he asked, "why do we still use these old tractors? Billy Peterson's dad has a new Case Magnum with GPS and everything." I stopped my work and wiped my greasy hands on a red rag. I looked around the shed at the familiar shapes of the machines that had seen our family through the best and worst of times. "Henry," I said, putting my hand on his shoulder. "That new tractor Billy's dad has. It's a fine machine. It can do amazing things. But the bank owns it. The computer company that made the software owns a piece of it. The dealership that has the tools to fix it owns a piece of it. His dad is just the guy who gets to make the payments." I pointed at the John Deere. "This tractor, though, we own it. Every last nut and bolt. When it breaks," I tapped the cylinder head with my knuckle, "you and I can fix it, right here, with these tools. It doesn't ask for much, just gas and oil and a little bit of care. And in return, it gives us everything we need and nothing we don't. It gives us freedom." I picked up the valve-lapping tool again and handed it to him. "Your granddad used to say, 'Never finance iron.' It took me and your uncles a long time to understand what he really meant. He wasn't just talking about tractors. He was talking about a way to live. Don't ever let a thing own you." Henry nodded, a slow, thoughtful expression on his face. He took the tool and went back to work, the rhythmic, grinding sound filling the quiet shed. I watched him, his young hands learning the old ways, and I felt a profound sense of peace. The land stretched out beyond the open shed doors, bathed in the golden light of the setting sun. The farm was safe. The legacy was safe. My father's words, once a source of conflict, had become the foundation of our lives, as solid and enduring as the black earth itself.